I give a fuck? Why do I give a fuck? Why do I try so hard? Why do I care so much?
Welcome to Why Do I Give a Fuck? A cross-cultural conversation between myself, Diane Tate,
and Johanna Thompson. In these times of great struggle and possible shift, we ask ourselves,
why do we give a fuck about any of it? How does the lens we see the world through impact what we see?
And what do we do about it?
Right, so we thought because, so much is still occurring in the world that we would continue the conversation a little bit, do a little deeper dive.
Focusing on Israel, focusing on the relationship that Israel has to so many other major superpowers in the world and how there's a lot of support. So we're talking about the global march to Gaza, what's happening in Egypt and Egypt stopping it. And I know that you were following that very closely, so.
Yeah, well, it started with the Freedom Flotilla, the Madeleine, which was a boat that was traveling to Gaza to break the siege on Gaza with 12 activists slash celebrities. There were a couple of there was an actor on there, and Greta Thunberg, which is the German young person who has been so vocal in environmental circles. She was also on that boat, and so they were making a trek to Gaza to break the siege. They were commandeered and kidnapped off of the boat from Israeli soldiers by Israeli soldiers and taken into Israel, into occupied Palestine. And some of them were put in solitary confinement for a few days. Others, Greta did sign a document and they let her go and deported her, sent her home pretty early, but she is a young person, so I don't blame her for doing that. And so then the Freedom Flotilla sparked this global march to Gaza.
Over 4,000 people from 80 countries joined this march.
Sent people to Cairo, and their intention was to march to Gaza. And I remember, because my partner and I just returned back from Amsterdam, and I remember hearing the day that we left Amsterdam that the faction from the Netherlands was leaving Amsterdam, and I was so hoping we were going to get to see them at the airport. So I wanted to wish them well and and thank them for their efforts. But the global march to Gaza got stopped in Egypt, and they were not allowed to progress. Egypt said nope and started, harassing them and taking their credentials, their passports, they're intimidating them. There were, it was the behavior of the soldiers that were detaining the members of the Global March were very similar to IDF, IOF behaviors. And so a little sad that Egypt decided to partake and participate in that. But and I think there are still people that some have been deported and have left Egypt and have gone back to their countries of origin, but I think there are still people there that are still trying to further the trek, although I don't think they're going to get very far. And so your question was like, what is the impetus? Why do countries do Israel's bidding so willingly? And I think it's a really interesting question to ponder. And I know there are a lot of experts out there that have, been talking on this for many years, because Israel, the occupation of Palestine, has been happening for 76 years. So there's a lot of much more learned people out there talking on this than we are. But I'd be curious to hear what you think about it. I think it's just about time and narrative. And I think the fact that it's been 76 years of indoctrination and narrative, AIPAC is the American Israeli PAC. AIPAC is the lobbying organization that lobbies all of our elected officials and has their fingers and their hooks in all of our elected officials. A lot of money in our politics on U.S. soil from AIPAC, which is the Israeli lobby. And I think they're also very active in other countries, especially in their region. For being as small as they are, because they have the might and the heft and the support of the U.S. in terms of money and bombs and all of the things, I think 76 years of indoctrination into this has made us all think that they are this massive entity that they are. And I'd be curious to hear what your thoughts are on it are.
Well, the way I'm thinking about it is that Israel is US's baby stepchild. I'm not really sure.
Proxy, yeah.
You know what I mean? And because there's so much backing from the US population, you always have to follow the money trail. You always have to look at what capitalism looks like. You always have to look at what power and dominion over geographic areas that have a lot of resources that folks want. I'm thinking about those things in regards to Israel, but then I'm also thinking that Cairo is less, it's less Israel's bidding as if we are not participating with Israel in the way that is being set forth, then then we have issues with the United States, which is what we're experiencing with Iran right now. Right, we're seeing
that's a logical conclusion to go to draw.
You know what I mean? So it's just like that's what's happening. So because I was saying like what does Israel have? What's the hold that Israel has? But I really think it is because it is so backed by the US. And so really bringing it into a place of reflection on the US and the US population, really looking at what it is that it is supporting in this annihilation, because it does put the US territory, US soil, and the people on US territory and soil at significant risk, because now you're just going around the Middle East and the Middle East, people are communicating with each other nowadays, right? There's other reports that are coming in. Now you have to look at what the relationship between the Middle East and China. What the relation, in other places that have like stronger military power, or if other Middle Eastern nations come together under their faith-based understanding, then we really are creating an undergird of conflict that is hard to manage, right? I remember back in the day when I was young, they always talked about these cells and all of these kind of things that are popping up and existing because people are trying to come to a place where they can protect themselves. And that's what's going to happen when you corner anyone into a wall. They're going to, most people are going to be in responsiveness. And I'm watching Israel use its backing by the US to really transgress a lot, and thinking about following the dollars, following the money, understanding how capitalism plays into this and hierarchical structures to be able to continue with this type of power over.
And I've already seen them talking about China being the next boogeyman, that we're
the next boogeyman. That's the US has been in competition with China for years now, and it's just growing and developing more. And it's very interesting. I think I mentioned this before on another one of our episodes, but China's method of diplomacy, in building and being present in so many nations, there is some type of actual economic development that China is actually placing continent of Africa, on our island, in Jamaica. You see that in the US. I mean, we do have a majority of our produce products, not produce, but our products and everything like that do come from China. So there is developed already a relationship where we have a need for what China is producing, because we're reliant on that, and we like what we like. We like to have what we want to have, and so these are the things that it is important to be paying attention to and to be caring about, to be given an F about, because all of these things are definitely going to be directly impacting what's happening in your household. That's very real. Like in your household, like what you have access to, being able to move freely, being able to make the choices that you want to make. And as we watch the U.S. back Israel in its transgressions as a political project, that's going to look like, turning it back on U.S. soil as the U.S. is building and clearing spaces to be able to rise up this white nation. The Project 2025, that is what is actually happening.
So this is why we wanted to talk about this, because I just recently went to this past weekend. Was it this past weekend? I don't know, things happen so quickly. But not long ago, we had No King's Day here across the U.S. territories, and there were rallies and marches in over 4,000 cities across the country, I believe. And the one that I went to in my hometown was predominantly white. And I think I mentioned this in another episode. I wore a Palestine sweatshirt, and I had a sign that spoke to, the intention of the rally, but also said "Free Palestine" on it. And I have a mask that's a keffiyeh mask. So, but I was the only person. I only saw one other person that had anything keffiyeh related, Palestine related on, and she stopped and thanked me for wearing my keffiyeh mask. But I got the stink eye from people. They didn't, they were like, "That's not what we're here about. That's not what we're doing." And so I wanted to bring that forward again because I wanted to say that, we all should be giving AF. We should be giving a fuck about all of these pieces of the puzzle that are happening, because all of it impacts us. It impacts our global citizens of the world. It impacts we are not so far removed. I think the US people on US territory in this particular occupied land of Turtle Island love to think that we are isolated because we have oceans on either side, and we have this level of protection because we're not so close to the boogeyman that we've been. And I've always grown up thinking the Middle East is always the boogeyman, right? So, in Russia, but all of those places are so far away from us. We don't share borders with those countries. And so I think as US citizens and people that live on this territory, we get complacent thinking that we are untouchable. And I think that's why 9/11 rocked everybody's world so much, besides the fact that it was horrific and that so many people lost their lives. That initial horrificness of that moment, it was that we could be impacted at that level, that the things that we see other countries experience on the regular, we thought we were protected from, and all of a sudden it was on our soil. And so I guess I said all that to say that I want to reiterate what you were saying about how everything that happens around this world, especially when it's driven by our military industrial complex that rules everything in this country, is the driving force for whatever it is going to impact us. And that does not necessarily, I'm not fear mongering about what I spoke to an earlier episode about how, Iranians are going to be coming onto our territory and hitting us where we live. I'm not buying into that narrative, although that's entirely possible. I don't know, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm just talking about, like you were saying, to your point, if China is impacted, we are so dependent on China for all of our goods that if they stop sending to us or we stop letting the imports in or whatever, we're going to feel that impact greatly. We already are because of the tariffs. If, the Middle East and the oil reserves at the Strait of Hormuz that is controlled by Iran, if that gets closed, then oil prices are going to go through the roof, and we're not going to be able to drive our cars anymore. We're not going to be able to afford bus tickets or train tickets or airplane tickets, because all of those things are functioned by oil. And
or we'll be drilling on US territory.
Right. That's the other thing that Trump has already done. He's already opened up. Yeah. Yeah. He's already opened up a lot of our protected national parks, and specifically areas in Alaska. He has opened that for drilling. And drill baby drill was one of his things that he loved to say during his campaign. He's not afraid to do that. And so, but that just speaks to the destruction of the things that we hold beautiful in this country, that we have all taken for granted that would always be there and be unspoiled. So, it's a trickle down effect. And I think the most important thing that we can do, especially people that feel protected by our level of privilege, is to start to draw those connective dots and start to really think about all of the things that you use and touch and rely on your day to day. Where do they actually come from? How do you source access to those things? And I think you'll start to realize that pretty much everything that you depend on is going to be impacted in one way or another. And I'm not to say that doesn't necessarily give us answers of what to do about it, right? But it starts our awareness building about the connective tissue, because I think as USians, especially members of the dominant culture, we don't think about those connective tissues. We just take them for granted. And
that's a symptom of privilege, right? So
yes,
now
deep
that's
privilege.
the part. It's definitely a symptom of privilege where
Absolutely.
you couldn't put blinders on because you don't feel the direct impact.
Right.
Though that's changing now. You will be feeling the direct impact.
Oh yeah.
That's when you get woke up, right? That's when you're like, wait a minute, I have to figure out. But we don't want to do that when it's too late. We want to be, kind of
I need to wake up now.
These, want to be like being aware of what's going on. And I say that with also a bit of frustration because, if Donald Trump is making decisions to drop bombs and we aren't really utilizing our entire system that we have set up for checks and balances, that you're not going to Congress and getting approval, that you're just making decisions, that you're just doing what other presidents have done before, but in a way that is very visible, to show force and to show militarization of like the U.S. in a way that we have not seen in a very, very, very long time. I don't think that we've had like a military president in the same way that Donald Trump is showing his force. For like No King's Day was happening, but then also his birthday situation was happening where he has these tankers coming in, where in other communities around the states, I heard that tankers were coming in with this ICE force that's very vigilante, kind of like in their movement and in their operations. They're just going where they want to go and harassing humans in the US. And that's like unheard of. And in a place where we talk about our freedoms and our liberty being like the thing that we hold as like the social contract, it's the fabric of what being a US citizen looks like. All of those things are being taken away and like torn down. And as somebody who remains on US territory, what are the ways that you are going to have some self-preservation and some self-protection, because your government and the social contract of your government is taking and stripping away all of the things that make it fun, not fun, but make it comfortable to be on territory?
It's a great question. I have been thinking about it. I don't know. I haven't formulated a full plan yet about what that looks like. I've been learning more about how to protect others, because I know that I still walk in immense privilege. And so like this, a training that I took earlier today, just learning more about what my role can be. If I see ICE showing up and harassing other humans, what can I do? If they show up to my door, what are my rights? And, but it's an interesting question. I know that a lot of people are probably a lot further along than I am in terms of if tomorrow and I had no access to anything, how would I function? So,
but what happens, Deanne, when you start being targeted because you're supporting, right?
Yeah.
Like real talk, like, you know what I'm saying? Like real, like that's the self-preservation that you have to like start thinking about. Like, it's still like, okay, now you're supporting this. Oh, now you're trying to interrupt this ICE situation. Oh, we getting you too, or oh, we're not letting you back into the country, or we're deporting you out to some place.
Yeah, it's possible
because you don't like it's real. Like that's the law passing, through Congress and through Senate. So it's just like this is not the U.S. that we know. We knew that it wasn't going to be the U.S. that we know. And how are people existing in this? I knew that it wasn't going to be the U.S. which is why I left. But I have all my family, all my ties there.
Yeah.
And so I'm always very curious, not curious, but I'm always speaking to them about being in caution. Like somebody like my mother, who like used to joke and be like, oh, Johanna, tell people why you're leaving, and kind of be like, oh, like she's really, and now she's like, oh, my daughter knew that this was coming. She was aware that all these things are happening, and she like made a decision to remove herself from having to deal with it. I have a young person who is in university, who wants to continue with university. I'm trying to get her to study abroad, so that you can continue with university, but do it someplace else. There's an opportunity for you to not be subjugated to what is happening with taking your autonomy and liberty as a citizen of the United States? What does that mean in this moment? What does that mean? Like, how are you what is the benefit? How are you holding safety and self-preservation under this type of regime, which is that's the only way that I know to call it.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. You're not the first person that's asked me that, and I know that I'm very vocal. I wear my keffiyeh everywhere. I have Palestine stuff all over my car. I would be easily identifiable if that became the reason to start to, I mean, it already is, as we have seen the university students getting detained. By the way, yay from Abu Khalil, he's free. He was released and he's back with his wife and his son. That was the Columbia student that was taken, one of the first students, university students that were disappeared and taken to an ICE detention center in Louisiana. He was finally freed yesterday. So we're very, very happy that he's home with his wife and finally gets to hold his son born while he was detained. But I said all that to say that obviously people have already been disappeared for their support of Palestine. To my knowledge, not necessarily anyone that would be white presenting, but mostly people who are Black and brown. So I do know that is a potential. It doesn't stop me from having the signs in my car, and maybe that's naive of me, but I'm not thinking a lot about self-preservation right now. Actually, I'm thinking more about how can I help others, because I know that in the grand scheme of things, I'm going to be safer than other people that don't look like me, especially as a white woman, especially as a white woman of means, especially as a white woman of a certain age. But I'm not kidding myself to think that it's not something I need to think about, but I'm still very focused on how I can be of service to anybody else. That's
and everyone needs to be thinking about how they can be of service to everyone else as they are thinking about preserving their own safety, protection and autonomy.
I'm just not ready to take the signs off of my car and to not wear my keffiyeh and to, I'm just not. It's my little act of resistance, but it just, I can't. When I traveled abroad, I didn't wear my stuff and it drove me nuts. I wore it once I got there, but I didn't wear it in transit.
Travel.
And I felt naked not having it on.
You chose not to do that so that there wouldn't be something that you got stopped for, or so that you wouldn't.
Because I was concerned for my partner. I knew it would impact him greatly if anything happened to me, if they tried to,
try to say you or to question him because you're wearing this, but he's
right. And I wanted to protect him.
He's a bad influence on you.
Because he's not white, I wanted to protect him, so I chose to do that. But I did, I think I mentioned before that they tried to tell us that we had to use biometrics to get on the plane, and I refused. I didn't consent to the biometrics, and the guy gave me a hard time for it. And then when I was coming back in through customs, I said I didn't consent to the biometrics. So it just took me longer to get through customs, where my partner just had the biometrics picture taken and he walked right through. Yeah. I'm just not, it's not easy for me to not be, I'm going to do whatever the fuck I want. And if it bothers you, So, but I know that I need to pay attention to that, and I know that I need to be thinking about that. But I'm still just focused on and it's not about me being this amazing human. It's just, I still believe that I hold a higher level of safety than other folks because of my privilege. So I'm going to use it as long as I can.
And that's real. And a number of people, if they could be thinking in that same way, right? Because it really does come down to, even when we were having the conversations about, Black Lives Matter and what are white folks going to do? Because we are in this situation now because of the systems and the structures that have existed in the United States that are crumbling, and they're crumbling in a way that we didn't have an expectation, hoping that they would be rebuilt, but not rebuilt for a white nation, rebuilt for a more inclusive nation that allows people to have the liberty that is what the U.S. the idea of the U.S. was founded on.
The original.
Right. And we
We've never been that way.
hold those things, right? So the privilege, regardless of like, you know, how you identify, we as a U.S. citizen, you hold those things. You can travel someplace else, and when things do not show. I'm thinking about when I was traveling, you know, back in Europe in I don't know, 2 years ago now, but like things were not in English, and I had an expectation. I'm like, why are things not
Did you?
Oh yes, all like, and that was me like snapping into that U.S. citizen privilege that we have.
Doesn't everybody speak English?
Right? And shouldn't we have information and signs and stuff like that are in English, because everybody speaks it. But you have to like bring yourself back from that, and especially now, because even on U.S. territory and U.S. soils, you are not having that level of privilege that you had before, even as a white identified woman. Regardless, yes, you have more privilege, but you also have limitations. You also have to be in consideration when you do travel with your partner to not cause your partner to possibly have any issues, which is a limit on your liberty, on your freedom of movement that you did not think about before. Right. Or for people who are U.S. citizens who feel like they have to stay in their house, or the people who have visas and passes and have done all of the things that they're supposed to do to be able to work, to be able to contribute to U.S. society, U.S. culture, and all of that kind of stuff, and you being limited on that. And that is not what the principle. That's not a principle that the U.S. was founded on. Right. And all of those things are being removed, and that is what people are paying attention to, and that people should be standing against, and also calling in. It's not a time to say this is not my fight, or I'm going to sit back and wait and see what happens, because everyone is going to have some form of impact from these type of shifts in our country. Yeah.
That's why we should all give a fuck, right? We should all care about what's happening, and what's happening to our neighbors is not very far from what's going to be happening to us. What is happening to us already on some level, and so I'm glad that we're talking about it, because it's a real thing.
Yeah, and going back to your algorithm, checking in with people who are speaking about the impact of the experience on U.S. territory and soil at this point, right? So if you can, like, I don't know, find somebody on your algorithm somewhere where you can hear that different people, like, what is the impact? Because you don't know until you know, and you need to be knowing. And a lot of
actually, it's interesting because as this morning I started reaching out to my different groups of people threads that I'm on, and saying, is anybody following any profiles from Iran that I can start following? Because that's how I learned. Because I've said before, I didn't know anything about what was happening in Palestine before October 7th. I had bought the indoctrination. I was clueless. And so after that happened, the first thing within the first week, the thing that I really wanted to do was I wanted to hear from Palestinians that were on the ground in Gaza. So I followed a bunch of profiles of recommendations of folks that were in Gaza. And that's how I learned what was happening. That's how I got educated about what was happening in Palestine. So now, because of what's happening in Iran, I was like, I want to follow Iranian voices, because those are the people that I want to learn from, not from all of these, talking heads over here in the Western culture. I want to hear from the ground, what is happening. And so to your point, that's what I'm trying to beef my algorithm up with, voices from Iran, so that I can learn what's happening over there.
Absolutely. And how people are being, not just over there, but what the impact. Oh my goodness. On you.
Bless you.
Oil and territory. What is going on?
It's a rest, my friend. You feel better.
Thank you so much. Blessings. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Thanks for joining us. Until next time, as you move throughout your day, continue to ask yourself,
Why do I give a fuck?
is produced in collaboration with Johanna and Diane. Music by Norwegian musician Water. See you next time.